Welcome to another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I am your host, Graham Hall, joined once again by Blake Alderman, and we are here today to recap what has been a very busy month for Florida on the recruiting trail. As we talked about briefly in our last episode of the podcast, on May 31st was when high school prospects were officially allowed to visit campus again for official visits. And the Gators have made sure to have double-digit visitors every single weekend. I believe 40 is the number that they've had on campus, as well as multiple players dropping in for unofficial visits, some 2026 kids around as well. Camp season is absolutely about to get into full swing. So it has been a busy time when it comes to the talent acquisition process here in Gainesville. And today's episode, we're going to briefly recap each weekend that Florida has had over the past 3 weeks. And we're also going to take a little bit of a look at this upcoming weekend, which is going to have a little bit of a different spin on Friday Night Lights. If you follow recruiting and Florida's annual recruiting showcase, and you know that Friday Night Lights is usually there in the middle of July, late July, you know that it's going to be a little bit of a different event this year. And we're going to talk about that with Blake today. But let's just dive right into it. That May 31st weekend, Florida hosted, I believe, 14 prospects on campus. Just Blake, who were some of the priority targets in town, and what stood out to you from catching up with every single one of them? Before you go, if you want to get more information on all these players, Blake has caught up with them consistently over at Swamp247. You can get deep dives, interviews with each player, so make sure you check those out. But Blake, just what are some of your impressions with how Florida fared in that first official visit weekend?
Yeah, 14 guys, like you said, that first weekend there on May 31st. And I think that start maybe, I guess, with the more unpleasant news of that weekend. Two guys that Florida had been pretty consistently recruiting: 4-star offensive lineman Zaire Addison and 3-star defensive back Caleb Singleton. Both of those guys come out of the visits. They're uncommitted. They're going to take some more visits. It's been a couple weeks since then. Both of those guys have since committed somewhere else. Addison committed to Oregon after an official visit there, a couple weeks after Florida. Oregon was a team that had been in there for quite a while. Everyone's kind of thinking, man, a Florida guy, right there from that Tampa area committing to Oregon, had been there a lot of times. And Singleton, maybe a little bit more of a surprise, I guess you could say, just because Florida has been the team trending. He's mentioned the staff really kind of pushing him to get this thing wrapped up with. Took that official visit to Florida, went to Syracuse and Rutgers, popped to Rutgers. But I think if you look at where Florida's at in the defensive backboard, Singleton's one of those guys that could kind of move around the secondary between safety and corner. Corner is an area where Florida has done a good job between transfer portal guys that they've added, like Cormani McClain, guys they added back there in the earlier cycles under Billy Napier. They had a really good defensive back cycle. Last two classes, they've done a good job adding there. So I think corner maybe isn't as big of a deal. They're obviously the board this year in 2025. A little hard to kind of dissect which guys maybe could be leaning towards Florida. Where are the guys that Florida has the best shot with their safety? If you look at Singleton as a safety, I think you're in a little bit better of a spot because Florida's has hosted a couple of these safety targets. They're in a really good spot later weekends that I'll get into as we kind of roll down the list. But Addison was a big burn, guy Florida really liked. Singleton, it's a guy that I guess more so burns because you think that he was leaning towards Florida, but in the sense of other names on the board that Florida's maybe prioritizing a little bit more. Not that they didn't want Singleton, but the guys they were prioritizing more, Florida's still in a very good spot with. And I think just looking at some of the other guys in there, 4-star edge commit Javian Hilson is committed to Florida State. He visited Florida that first weekend. Came out of that saying Florida made a big move. They're second on the list for him. He's since visited Texas and UCF, and he'll be at Florida State this weekend. After Texas visit, he said the Longhorns were number 2 on his list right now, so they've sort of bumped Florida there on that list. So, a couple other guys that I think Florida maybe in a better spot with, 3-star wide receiver Nashawn Montgomery, right there out of the South Florida area there at Miami Central, a guy that has visited Florida, has camped at LSU since that visit at Florida, will be at Penn State this weekend. Florida seems to be pushing the hardest. I think they're in a really good spot. Joshua Moore, a big body wide receiver. Florida wants to get that X type of receiver on and that in what they would like to have a deep wide receiver haul this cycle. Josh Moore coming out of that visit to Florida there on May 31st. It seemed like Florida State battle. He's visited Florida State since. Georgia is on the schedule this coming weekend. We'll see how that goes there because there hasn't really been a lot of talk about the Bulldogs. It seems mainly, like I said, Florida State battle. Another guy that I think is worth a couple guys. Jeremiah McLeod, Florida's defensive line commit. He visited that weekend for his official visit, but has also come back every other weekend after for official visits on unofficial visits to spend time with those visitors. So a guy that's really recruiting hard for Florida, 3-star defensive line target, Jarquez Carter out of Newberry. I think the biggest storyline with him was this was a guy that was talking about decision later in the fall, going to take some official visits this summer, more game day visits in the fall. After the Florida visit, he kind of backed off that, and now he's looking more like a summer decision timeline for him. And that's a guy that I think, Newberry, Florida, right up the road from Gainesville, Florida really tried to take a big swing because A, he's a local guy, B, he's a guy that they really like, and I think C, you're the first visit of what was going to be several visits in the summer. He had I believe 3 other official visits to take, and then he's going to take an unofficial visit to Ohio State there in the month of June. So you've got to kind of weather the storm of those other visits for him. And I think tight end position, Florida's looking at ideally signing 2 guys at that position. And I think they very well could have had what I think will be their tight end class there on that May 31st weekend. A couple 3-star guys, Micah Jones and Tayshawn Gelsey. Micah Jones from the state of Mississippi left Florida that weekend saying the Gators are his leader. I think a decision could be coming soon. He sort of teased some things on social media there, still like Florida where they sit there. A guy that's more of a combo type of tight end, a guy that can kind of impact the game as a blocker, can play some of the, in the passing game there too. So a guy that has the size but can also catch the ball. It's kind of what they wanted to fit in there. But I think they can also pair him with a 3-star guy in Tayshawn Gelsey from up there in the Jacksonville area, who's more of a big wide receiver, I guess, but they view him as a tight end. He's sort of that Kyle Pitts-esque mismatch on the offense, maybe just a guy that can play wide receiver, can play some tight end there, can do a little bit of everything with him. I think Florida's in a good spot where both of those guys. So I think that those are some of the big visitors. Antoine Hill, obviously you have to talk about him. Quarterback's a position that everyone wants to know each cycle. He visited Florida there. It seems like Florida at that time had sort of picked up their recruiting efforts with him, whereas things maybe have been a little bit slower. And I think that's maybe due to just names dwindling off the board for Florida right now at that quarterback position. So Memphis is the team Florida's been battling. He's since visited Memphis. I would lean towards Memphis right now as far as who's going to be able to get Antoine Hill. He's talked about a potential July commitment, so maybe some things marinate a little bit more, that he's kind of settled down off the visit highs. But, I think that's one guy of note. And, some of the other guys, Florida had plenty of other guys, obviously, with 14 guys on campus that weekend. But I think those are some of maybe the more notable ones or should mention type guys.
Yeah, I definitely think that fans can sometimes get a little bit worried when you come out of an OV weekend and you don't get someone to commit immediately after. But, keep in mind, this is the summer. Players still want to take visits elsewhere. You mentioned Montgomery. Let's see how that visit goes for him at Penn State this weekend. Getting Jarquez Carter to move his timeline up, I think, is a win in and of itself, because that's the guy who was looking at, taking an OV to Ohio State in September. So certainly, it's not all for naught here, and we'll have to see how it actually pays dividends for Florida for that first official visit weekend. The second one, from looking at the list, it was hard for me to get an understanding of where Florida ranked with a lot of these guys. It kind of felt like a little bit of a make-up ground type weekend. Get a bunch
Agreed.
Of players who are still looking at Florida, certainly, but maybe don't have them as a top school. What was the sense you got from some of the guys that were on campus there for that first weekend in June, that June, 7th to 9th weekend? What was the sense that you got from those guys?
Yeah, I think you kind of painted it perfectly. That was more of a weekend to where you shoot your shot, you see if you can make a move, you sort of maybe put in some of the foundation of building this house, if you will, of recruiting for down the road. You sort of kind of put in that legwork. So, there were a lot of guys that I think the storyline wise, Florida had some ground to make up for. That was by far a big step up in talent from May 31st to June 7th weekend. You had 3 5-stars on 24/7 Sports that visited that weekend. The first one, Caleb Cunningham, a guy that, like I said, Florida wants to sign a deep wide receiver board. If he's not number one on the wish list, he's pretty high up there for that wish list for the Florida staff. So a guy that had visited Auburn on that May 31st weekend, then turned around and visited Florida. After the Auburn visit, Auburn was the leader for him. Come back to Florida the next weekend. It's sort of 1A, 1B. And I think that the interesting thing is he since visited Tennessee. Tennessee's a team that he's mentioned high up there on his list, but didn't quite say that, leader, or really kind of paint maybe a direct standing of where they are, sort of like how he painted Auburn and Florida. So I've have always viewed the state of Mississippi. That's a state to where it's tough to get guys out of that state if you're not Ole Miss or you're not Mississippi State, or if you're maybe a kind of a smaller tier guy, even Southern Miss. Those are guys that are hard to get out of state. I think I've covered, my first recruiting class was the 2013 class here at Florida. And I could be wrong, just not really diving deep on the commitment list, but KD Daniels this past cycle was the first guy that I can remember Florida signing out of the state of Mississippi since I've covered recruiting. And again, that's just kind of going off memory there. But like I said, it's tough. Caleb Cunningham, I had him viewed as a guy that, again, hard to get out of the state of Mississippi. He's come out of that Tennessee visit, and he's mentioned that he's looking towards leaving the state. He's going to make it a later decision. We'll see. There's obviously time. The in-state schools aren't doing those official visits. They would more than likely have a chance to do that in the fall with him wanting to make that later decision. So we'll see if he sticks to that plan. But I guess if you're looking where you're at Florida, he made a big move there. 5-star offensive lineman Solomon Thomas, who is committed to Florida State. Kind of heading into that visit, Florida has long been in that recruitment. They've been a threat. They've continued to get him on campus. That's a guy that I think most Florida fans would have said that they've been tracking that one. It's not one to where they just kind of put him on the back burner. But as of, the spring months, it seemed like LSU had sort of moved into that position of becoming a big threat to Florida State. He visited them before he visited Florida, then gets to Gainesville, gets time around campus and staff that he's already really familiar with. And he comes out of that visit to Florida saying that it's pretty much neck and neck as far as who has the best shot to flip him from Florida State. He will visit Florida State this coming weekend. So we'll see if they can get him to shut it down, what they've got coming out of that visit. So I think that that's a big telltale for me. So you're willing to see what is he going to do after that? Is he going to shut it down? Will he continue to – is he too torn still? Needs to take more things into the fall. So I think we'll see what happens there. But I do think Florida has done a really good job. And, again, someone to continue to track. 5-star safety Trey McNutt. That's one that Florida offered in March, a little bit behind some of the other schools. I think they've done a good job of making up some ground between recruiting him hard, got him on an unofficial visit, got him on an OV. I think that if there's a table of teams at his recruitment, I think Florida has a seat. But I think that USC is a team in good spot. Oregon's in this good spot. A&M has hosted him. He's from the state of Ohio. Dad played it on the 2002, I believe it was, national championship team at Ohio State. So a guy that is from that state, has those family ties. But I do think USC is one that I'm at least watching. I think Oregon has a good shot. They'll host him this weekend. So Florida commit Jalen Wiggins visited Stanford already. He'll be at Florida State this weekend. Visited Florida that weekend of the 7th. Was back again during the week, this past week, to spend some time, even into the weekend, spending time around some of the official visitors there. Seems like he's very solid with Florida. I think that the last couple of visits have really kind of confirmed that earlier decision for him. But he's a Tallahassee guy. He'll be at Florida State this weekend. He's popped in for a 7-on-7 there. He's camped at Florida State. They're continuing to chip away at him. So you still have, I guess, one more jump at least this summer with Florida State trying to kind of put the screws on him. So we'll see how that goes that weekend. I think just kind of scanning there, you look at Ben Hanks Jr., 4-star defensive back there out of the Miami area. It's a familiar name for Florida fans. His dad, Ben Hanks Sr., played linebacker at Florida under Steve Spurrier. There's obviously the story of Spurrier unretiring his number 11 for Ben Hanks Sr. There's obviously those family ties. It was I guess I would say a cool moment that on the official visit, the way the schedule's set up, they go to different places depending on the weekend for dinner, but Spurrier's is usually one of those spots, that restaurant that's owned by Steve Spurrier. So Spurrier was actually there when these guys had dinner. I believe it was on Saturday. So it was kind of a cool picture to see, Ben Hanks Jr., his dad, Spurrier, all there together. So I'm sure that was probably a cool moment for those guys to kind of collect together. Miles Johnson, I think, is a guy to continue to watch. 4-star linebacker there out of the state of Alabama. He's been committed to Alabama since this past fall. But since that coaching change turnover, Nick Saban retires, new staff comes in. He's mentioned contact hasn't been as strong with that new Alabama staff. So has visited Florida in January. That's when he was offered, comes back for the official visit. I think that Florida's in a good spot just because I think unless something changes with contact level and what's going on in Alabama between him and them, Florida's in a good spot. He visited Ole Miss this past weekend. Haven't heard anything much coming out of that. I think maybe that's more where you have to go back and do a temperature check, see if anything's there, anything's changed. But he's since come back to Florida for an unofficial visit after that OV there on the weekend of June 7th. So I think Florida's in a really good spot there. Again, like that, like we said, that weekend was kind of a tough one to where you look like outside of Jalen Wiggins, who's been committed, it was kind of one of those weekends to where you try to make up some ground. So we'll see where things pan back. I guess, I don't know if it's a hot take. Usually I'm pretty bad at those because I look back and they're always terribly wrong. But I would say of the 3 weekends that Florida hosted, guys, I think that this June 7th weekend may be the one where the hit rate of landing those guys that weekend, I don't know if that one's going to be as high as maybe their shot on the other weekends they had.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to always have some commits around those guys who you're looking to make up some ground on because they can get a personal experience and relate to players there who are already committed. But yeah, it does feel like that was one where Florida was kind of shooting their shot at some guys. And I think that's evidenced by having 3 5-stars on campus. It's always a win when you can get 5 stars on campus in general. I don't think that's a loss, whatever, but it also is kind of it embodies, I think, where Florida is right now as a program. A lot of these highly rated guys want to see how Florida does this upcoming season. And if they do well and exceed expectations, they can think about the impressive OV that they had back in June, and maybe that helps a little bit. And you can always take an unofficial visit to campus. But certainly outside of a couple of those guys, it does feel like this was one where Florida was just looking to make up some ground with some guys. Now, last weekend was, I think, a lot more of these are players we have a realistic shot with. Let's get some commits here as well and see how we do. I mean, you look at Malik Autry, you look at Vernell Brown, obviously a name familiar to Florida fans. This seemed to be the big one, and you always want to, I think, kind of go out with a bang to cap an OV visit weekend. Just what was the sense that you got from this previous weekend here, having some high priority guys on campus?
Yeah, I think that June 14th weekend, if you look at it, I think it's one of those weekends to where it's Florida's last weekend they're hosting official visitors, so you want to sort of get the last say with some of those guys that are high on your board. Not to say that other weekends didn't have guys that were high on Florida's board, but it's some of those guys that maybe Florida feels really good about where they stand at. You can go in for that sort of last hurrah official visit. But I also think that it's a good mix of really talented players that Florida had on campus, along with guys that I think they feel like they have a good shot with. So this was kind of, I guess, a good mix of both weekends, kind of setups of how things go. Start out there, Florida had a guy that would be technically considered a 2024 prospect, an offensive lineman, Jazir Jackson, a guy that is a former basketball player as far as playing at IMG Academy there. He played at Overtime Elite there in the Atlanta area as a basketball guy, a guy that I've seen listed anywhere between 6'11", 6'9". Either way, large human being. It's kind of hard for me, like being like 5'10", maybe 5'11", if I'm on my tippy toes. You can kind of sometimes eye test. He's this much taller than me. He's probably closer to 6'1". When you get to that size, like you're just really big. So I don't know which one I would lean towards, maybe how tall he is, but really tall either way. But a guy that, again, was a basketball guy in high school, did play football. It's not like football is brand new. He played in middle school, but as he got really tall, really shifted towards the basketball, court. So he did that at IMG, played OT Elite, which is more of a semi-pro basketball league that you can play in those high school type ages. Once you hit around 20, which he is, you sort of kind of max out on your eligibility there. I think he tinkered some with the NBA draft. I don't believe that's something he's proceeding with, given that he's been camping at a lot of these schools for football, but really sort of made his name, I guess, as far as a football guy. Camped at FSU this past Monday last week, and schools are calling. Florida called. They're like, hey, you're right up the road. Like, come down here and camp. So he went and camped on Tuesday of last week. Staff really liked what they saw as far as there's raw in his game, but there are areas of athleticism, obviously the size, the length. It's sort of a big, very big ball of clay that you can mold down the road. So again, 2024 guy. So he's looking to have a decision in the next couple of weeks, be somewhere for summer B. He's at Florida State now. Will be at Mississippi State for a midweek official visit. Georgia will be this coming up weekend. So Florida was the leader coming out of that visit this past weekend. He took his official visit, but they still have to weather the storm of some other visits going forward. But 2024 guy, I think when you look at where Florida's at, we've mentioned in past shows that the numbers have been crunching. I would think that this is a guy that he says he's got an offer, but I would think just the way the numbers work, unless there are some areas where I'm unfamiliar with, probably a guy that's going to be a PWO to start out there as the preferred walk-on. And then later on, when numbers sort of are able to be moved around more, guys move on, portal, draft, eligibility runs out, you can sort of tinker with your numbers more then. So That's a 2024 guy. Everyone else there was a 2025 guy. And again, I just think this is one where you could really mention a lot of guys that I think are worth note. Vernell Brown III, a legacy wide receiver, one of the best wide receivers in the state of Florida from what I've seen from a ranking standpoint, from just my personal view of seeing him compete in camps and games and et cetera, et cetera. Legacy guy, dad, grandpa, I think another uncle. So there's a long line of family members that have played at Florida. But he's sort of kind of thrown the legacy aspect out of the recruiting process. I think it's something that he's become more open to as of late, but Ohio State had the buzz early on. Florida and Florida State have been sort of getting some chatter most lately. Miami hosted him for a bit of a midweek this past week. They've made a little bit of a move there. He'll be at Florida State this weekend. I think Florida's in a good spot, but he's a guy that's very methodical, going to take all of his official visits, sit down and make a really well-informed decision. And I think that that's one that I think Florida's in a really good spot with, and I think that a decision for him, he's saying, will come sometime in July. Not quite ironed out as far as days, but like where Florida's at now. But again, a guy that's going to take his time and do his due diligence. Safety in general was an area of focus. I mentioned where if you look at Caleb Singleton back on the May 31st visit weekend, who's since committed to Rutgers, if you view him as a safety, not so bad, because Florida's got some safeties on the board that they're really good players, that they're in a really good spot with. And I think that became apparent from that June 14th official visitor weekend, because you've got like guys like four-star USC commit Hilton Stubbs, guy that had Florida really high on his board early on. Alfred, I believe, last January has visited more times than I could collect in my head. He's been there a lot. Took his official visit. Had Florida as his leader there in January, but it was a little bit of a surprise there in March committing to USC after visiting there. Has taken his official visit to USC, said he feels a lot better about his decision to commit somewhere very far away coming out of that official visit, then turned around and visit Florida. It's probably, he said, one of his better visits. Just the hospitality shown to him and his family, the time around the players. He said that visit really cemented Florida as that, number 2 school. It's really close between USC and Florida. So I think if you're Florida and you're in the position to have to flip this guy, and you know that he's looking how your season's going to go this year, you got to really show some progress there. If you're going to have to flip a guy, of course, best case would have been to flip him on that official visit and he shuts it down. But if you're a very close second, that's probably the next best thing that you can hope for. So he was a good guy that Florida made a good movement with, it seems. I think the biggest mover, maybe one of the storylines that maybe wasn't talked about a lot, was four-star safety Lagonza Hayward, a guy out of Toombs County there in Georgia. He's from Pahokee originally, so he's got some Florida ties. Entered this weekend. It seems like, visited Georgia, has visited South Carolina for official visits. Every official visit he takes, school's making a big move. So Georgia got him that first weekend, they make a big move. South Carolina makes a big move. Now that Florida has hosted him, he says they lead a little bit over South Carolina. So they've got the slight edge. But now you have to turn around and have an official visit to Tennessee this weekend, a team that I believe around early spring, maybe into February there, that they were the team that was pointed to as the leader. So you've got a guy that, again, has another official visit coming up, has shown some up and down twists and turns through his official visit schedule. But from everything I've heard, Florida really liked how the visit went, and it's clear him saying that they lead. But I don't know if it's one where you still have to hold your breath. And even if he does have a twist and turn there, decision for him is going to come on July 27th, which is his birthday. So you've still got time for sort of the visit high to wear off. And then the other safety, four-star Bryce Fitzgerald, a guy that left saying Florida's top 2 with Florida State. He'll visit Miami this weekend. He's a guy from down there in the Miami area. LSU's another team in the play there. But as of right now, it looks like from what he's saying, Florida State battle. I think Florida's in a really good spot. So you basically left this weekend with 3 safety targets that are high on your board. You're in the top 2 range for all of them, and you lead slightly for one of those guys. So I think safety was a spot where things became very clear. Linebacker, 2 of the top targets, Tavian Wallace, guy who grew up in a Florida family household. Florida State has been the leader for several months now. Florida's consistently made up some ground there, and he said it's like a 1A, 1B between those 2 teams coming out of that official visit last weekend. He's not sure which one is 1A and which one's 1B, but, if you're Florida and you're making up that ground there, you've got family ties of him being a Florida fan. His dad is a Florida fan, has been a Florida fan for quite some time. And I remember whenever he was offered by Florida, I believe it was last spring, summer, something like that, he mentioned whenever then Jay Bateman was at Florida, called him and sent him an offer. that, he's out in the yard with his dad, picks up the phone, he's talking to him. And the dad's like, which team is that? And pointed to his truck, his dad's truck. And I guess there's a big Gator sticker on the back of that. And dad's hype, kids hype. So that was an exciting moment for them. So you've got that Florida family vibes there. So guy that Florida really likes. And I think one of the ones at the linebacker position, again, a top guy, 4-star Ty Jackson there out of the Loxahatchee area there down in the southern part of Florida. A guy that I think entered the weekend as a recruitment that I probably didn't know enough about, just kind of where the standings is. And I don't know that I really have a clearer picture coming out of it. A guy that does very few interviews, doesn't have a lot to say, really keeps things to the vest. We talked to his dad, update on Swamp247 yesterday about that. Florida did a really good job, and they posted him several times, I think 6-7 times, 3 times alone this year if you count the official visit. So he's going to make a decision much later in the fall. He'll be at Alabama this weekend for an OV. Dad says they'll be back at Florida for that Florida-Miami game for an unofficial visit. So that recruitment will stretch into the fall, and if not, closer to November, December. But I don't know that I know maybe a pecking order or a teams to watch at this point. But from talking to the dad, Florida is a team that is higher up there on the list, I guess. I don't know where exactly, but they're in this thing. They made a really good impression this past weekend. And I think just scanning other guys there, Florida had 2 Auburn commitments on campus this past weekend. 5-star defensive lineman Malik Autry, a guy that declined interviews with media after his official visit, hasn't really wanted to talk about his time in Gainesville. But from all things I've heard, Florida feels good about how they hosted him, just the time they had with him on campus. But a guy that I'm starting to get in that range of losing count how many times he's been to Florida. Just don't know, you came out of that visit again. What else does he need to see? What else can you do? So I think at this point, Florida has really laid out everything on the table. It's on him, whatever he wants to do. Lives about 15 minutes, 20 minutes from Auburn's campus right there outside of there. So he's been able to pop up in there a couple times unofficially this summer. So I think that one's going to be tough, but I do think Florida has done enough to where they feel like they're in it. They look like they're in it from everything I've heard, but I just don't know if they're going to have enough to kind of bump Auburn off that pedestal of long-time commitment right up from up the road. And they've done a really good job with him. And I think the other guy that the Auburn commit, 4-star offensive lineman Tavares Dice. I think if you're looking at the 2 Auburn commitments, that's one where I feel like Florida does have a much better realistic type shot because it's been Auburn and Florida for most of the year. Most of his recruitment has visited those schools by far more than anyone else. Both were in there early, made him a priority. Committed to Auburn, I believe it was around March. Florida was like, hey, we're not slowing up. We're going to continue to recruit you all the way to the end, whatever you want to do. Took an unofficial visit there in the even later part of March after that, a commitment to Auburn. This past weekend takes the OV. Another guy that I think the feeling is that the visit went pretty well. He said that his recruitment will stretch into the fall, potential more game visits. He's not really quite sure of where that's at just yet. But I think it's a guy that Florida, I don't know if they really moved into this is a guy to watch, flip watch, kind of sound the alarms. This one's one to watch. But I do think Florida improved their chances, and they just continued to just become a threat as you continue to fall. I think best case, again, you flip this guy on the official visit. Worst case, this guy leaves the visit and says, yeah, I'm done. I'm going to Auburn. I'm shutting it down. So I think Florida got that next best case deal to where they're in this, but he's going to continue to watch things in the fall. So we'll see there. And those are some of the more notable visitors this past weekend. Again, 13 guys this past weekend. So Florida had a lot of guys. But I feel like there was big strides made and bigger headlines, I guess, out of this last weekend of guys that are really high on Florida's board and guys that I think they do have at least a puncher's chance to land.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that, you mentioned guys like Vernell, Hilton Stubbs. If I was Florida, I would have first guy who talked to Hilton from a player perspective would have been Jason Zandamella for me, in my opinion. I mean, maybe have someone who's going to negative recruit USC a little bit and sway someone from making that cross-country trip. But I know that Florida doesn't need that in their toolbox. They feel really good with where they stand with multiple guys right now. And like you said, it's kind of a waiting game for a lot of these guys here. So we'll definitely learn a lot more here, especially as the season gets a little bit closer. Guys look to make decisions in July before their senior season in August. But, I mentioned in the beginning that Florida may not have landed really, any of these guys that they hosted as OVs over the past 3 weeks, but it hasn't been a fruitless couple of weeks for Florida. They have landed a punter. I know that, you always talk about special teams for Florida. It's certainly been under the microscope a little bit, but you end up getting a punter. a guy who's ranked the number 18 punter in the 2025 class by Cole's Kicking. And they also, landed some value targets in the 2026 class, which I know it seems a little bit early for those, but anytime you can get a quarterback, a highly rated quarterback, in-state guy at this time of year to lock in, that's going to help your recruiting efforts for the 2026 class. Before we dive into the final weekend here of Florida having kids on campus, just what do you see in those additions that Florida made in the 2026 class and briefly at punter?
Well, I'm going to have you take a seminar, a class, deep dive by Punters for Dummies book to really kind of dissect those punter types, because he kicks ball well, kicks ball high. Like I don't know much about punters, but I do know that Jeremy Crawshaw on Florida's roster, he's running out of eligibility this past year. It's an area that, you may not think about from a fan aspect of, who's going to be the next punter. But Florida was needing one. So they got one of those guys. I believe he camped for them last week and on a visit. So turned around and made a decision, I believe, next day, a couple days afterwards. So it's at least one area to where you knew the need was there, because Florida has offered another punter earlier this cycle that has since committed to Alabama, did host him on an official visit. So just given the need and, just the spot on the roster there, Florida, it was clear that was an area from top to bottom when you look at what you want this cycle. The punter was one of those areas. So check that box off. That's done. So I guess that's the best case you've got there. And even, this 26 guys, you look at the 26 class, and Florida's ranked 8th now after landing these two guys, both 4-star guys, both guys from the state of Florida in that Tampa area. And that's a good thing to start off on a hot start. But there's a long way to go in any cycle. Even the 25 guys that committed in the spring, those guys aren't always safe when the season rolls around and when signing day rolls around. So it's good to have a great start. And I think even when you look at Florida's 26 class, 4-star quarterback Will Griffin was a guy that was the first commitment for Florida in that 26 class. Visited there on June 1st. Is a guy that mom and dad, I think, went to Florida. Several family members went to Florida. So it's a Gator family, guy that grew up going to games since he was a little guy, continued to visit Florida a lot, had plenty of offers, made sure to look at literally, I think he's looked at almost every school there is in the country. He's taken that many visits. A guy that wanted to go ahead and get this thing rolling for Florida. You get your quarterback in your class. If you get that guy in there early, he's going to be active in recruiting other guys, whether it's, offensive guys around him, wide receiver, offensive line, like those guys that want to know, like, okay, well, who's going to be possibly my quarterback? So that's a good thing to get that out of the way. But just a guy that's going to be vocal. I mean, Will has visited Florida 3-4 times somewhere around there since he's committed to Florida, 3 weeks ago. So that's a guy that has no problem getting up there. He's going to be up there around guys when they visit, be vocal on social media. When he sees them camps, that's what you want for a guy that's going to be in your class, especially a quarterback. You want someone that's going to be vocal. So that's a good thing. 4-star defensive back Jalen Waters was another guy out of Sethner Armwood there that committed to Florida this past weekend. So another guy that really early on, I think January, he was offered by Florida. They were number 1 in his recruitment. More offers rolled in. Obviously, it's early in a 26 guy. Florida State was one of those offers. He committed to Florida State. I think he was committed there for maybe 34 days, I think it was. So short-lived commitment there. Opened things back up. And, immediately whenever this wasn't technically, if you count a flip, just of how quickly things turn around, whether they're, committed and flip that time right away, or they flip the next day, you can still kind of make a case for that being a flip. This guy still waited maybe a week or two. But I think that as soon as he opened his recruitment up, he was going to Florida. It seemed that way. So the guy that maybe was a little bit of a slow burn of making that decision did take an unofficial visit this past Thursday, committed, I think it was on Saturday. So a guy that, again, I think he said his dad has a Gator tattoo on his forearm. So a guy that, grew up in a Florida household. He knows a lot of those guys that are on the roster now as Tampa guys. So really likes Florida. He'll actually be there this coming Friday for Friday Night Lights, which I know we'll get into later. But a guy that, again, turning right around and being back at Florida. Tampa's not a far ride from Florida. So not only do you get guys that are in-state guys, Tampa has traditionally been pretty good to Florida, but you've got guys that are going to have no problem in getting up there to campus and seemingly going to be very vocal. So 26 class is very early. There's a lot of ways to go there. We're really haven't even started kind of cooking there with these 2025 guys of making their decisions. So, but it is a good start early on for Florida in 26 with both of those guys.
Yeah, getting players to commit in 2026, especially we've talked about, maybe to use the word hot seat, but just under the microscope that Billy Napier's coaching staff is, how much pressure is on this upcoming season, getting players to buy in spite of that, I do think it's impressive, and it's going to help your recruiting efforts, maybe even for the 2025 class, knowing that there's players who are willing to hop in early. And like you said, with Griffin, are going to be on campus and be around and make it feel like there's some security here in Gainesville with the current coaching staff. So
yeah,
certainly
I even just to not, I apologize, but I think even if, you mentioned the hot seat that is there, but these two guys in 2026, I don't have psychic powers. Unfortunately, I can't tell how the future is going to be, but if there is some kind of coaching shakeup, again, 2026 is a long time. I think you could make the case that both of these guys would maybe still stay intact, whether they do open it up and eventually find their way back to Florida, or they weather the storm to see who the new hire would be like. I mean, we're playing what if here, but again, Will Griffin, whole family full of Florida, dreamed of playing Florida growing up. Quarterback guy, wanted to be the quarterback for the Florida Gators when he was a little guy playing, throw him up, bust him up in the backyard with people in the neighborhood. So, and then you've got Jalen Waters, again, a guy Florida's was been kind of a household name type team for him growing up. So I think that even the good thing is yes, even whatever happens there, hot seat talk, yada, 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 you've got two guys that I think would still kind of wait and see what happens, whether they weather the storm, see what changes come and whatnot, or even if I could see those guys finding their way back to Florida if there were some type of change. So I think that that's notable even still with these 26 guys.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that there's this mentality, especially in the transfer portal era, that when you fire a coach and move on, you're going to have to, wipe the slate clean and start over from a recruiting standpoint. And I do think for Florida fans in general, who maybe miss the mentality of commit to a program, not a head coach, it's a little bit reassuring to know that there's guys out there that you may be able to maintain regardless of what happens here in the upcoming season. I do think that that's encouraging in its own right. Maybe not the best vote of confidence for Billy Napier and his coaching staff, but when it comes to a Florida football recruiting standpoint, I do think it's helpful to have players who may not be instantly looking to open it back up depending on what happens. Now, I know that we've put you on the spot, had you throw a ton of info out here and really appreciate it, but I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet. We've mentioned on the board for the past couple of weeks that different format for Friday Night Lights this year, and it really intrigues me because I thought that Friday Night Lights has lost a little bit of its luster, especially in the NIL era, especially with the amount of OVs that players can take now, not being limited to 5. I think it's a wise move to have this here as a little bit of a different option at the end of June, when a lot of players are still going to be taking official visits throughout the, this upcoming weekend. We mentioned guys like Montgomery going out of state. There's going to certainly be some players who are going to take some OVs, but Florida is expecting to have a significant number of prospects on their board here on campus for this 7v7 tournament that they're going to have for FNL. Just what's the information that you've gathered for what this weekend is going to look like, and where does it kind of stand for Florida when it comes to some players that they're after? What's one of the benefits also of seeing these guys compete in their own backyard, seeing how they interact, seeing their competitive level up close, and maybe get a chance to see how they're coached and how coachable they are? Because people always say, you're going to be able to evaluate the prospect at a very, very high rate, but getting a look at the person, how they are on the field, that is more valuable in my mind, because you're going to more often miss on those traits. Just what are some of the benefits of this weekend?
Yeah, well, I think to start, I don't know the wealth of talent. I don't know how that's going to go this weekend. Basically, Friday Night Lights is going to be more of a 7-on-7 type of setting, whereas it used to be, your basic camp. Come and get you a Florida Gators camp T-shirt, and we'll go out and do some drills out in the swamp, and we'll do one-on-ones and have a great time. Like I think that, like you said, has sort of lost the luster. NIL, like you said, it seems like it's turned the last several years into more of an underclassmen type camp. And that was back whenever it was in that last weekend of July, whenever the Florida would originally have Friday Night Lights. The recruiting calendar has since changed in the last couple of years. So there's like one last weekend there in July that is basically not a dead period. For the most part, that entire month is a dead period, which means no visits to campus. So most teams, and Florida included, have sort of shifted to Florida does a cookout. They have guys come in there and, have some barbecue, play some games, hang out with staff. It's more of a, hang out and vibe and get to know each other. There's still some recruiting, but it's not your typical, hey, let's sit in a meeting and watch some film, and we're going to, go see the Hawkins Center, and we're going to go, do this, that. And it's not your typical unofficial type visit. So they've since that changed. Like I said, the barbecue there is at the end of July. So they moved Friday Night Lights there to the end of June. And again, it still has continued to be more of an underclassmen camp. But this year, again, like I said, they're changing it to a 7-on-7. They have typically done these during the summer, but this is the first year where they've sort of made that shift from camp to 7-on-7. It'll have high school teams, from what I've understood it to be, come in and compete. And I think it's good because depending on some of the guys that you have there from those high school teams coming to compete, you get time around the staff, you get time around the campus. Coaches in general get to see these guys compete. But I think you build those inroads with high school coaches too. So I think that also is sort of maybe an unsung hero type of thing you get from having those high school coaches there too. So I'm unsure if this is going to be heavy 2026 underclassmen type thing. Will there be some 2025s in there? Because like you said, a lot of these guys are still taking official visits there on the weekend of the 21st. Florida's not doing any official visitors at last check for this weekend. So I don't have a roster of teams or an idea of teams that I'm expecting to be in there just yet. I hopefully will have something, and later on the week, on Swamp247, I'll be able to share some more of those teams that are playing this weekend. It kind of gives you an idea of maybe what kids in general to be there, whether it's going to be, oh, wow, this team has a really good 2025 guy, Florida likes 2026 heavy. I think we'll have a little bit better of idea. But even that's to say that guys that, just come in and just hang out. Maybe they're not doing the camp and 7-on-7 type tournament, not so necessarily camp, but they're not doing the tournament, but they're just coming to hang out and watch and see some of the guys, hang out with the coaches, all that. So I think we're waiting to see where the turnout is, and if this is maybe a shift that is more beneficial to getting some of these 2025 guys. I think, again, official visitors being there, we'll see. But I think in general, just the benefits of having it be a 7-on-7, you'll have some guys that won't come, like from what I've seen at Friday Night Lights in years past, you can have these big time guys come in and they just stand on the sidelines and watch. And the camp really is sort of underwhelming. You may have a handful of guys. A couple of years ago, we saw Jeremiah Smith out there just torching people in the swamp, but he took like 2 or 3 reps. Granted, all those reps were really good, just didn't have the really sustaining like wow factor that what I think most people that have followed recruiting a long time remember from some of the earlier years of Friday Night Lights. So I think that being a 7-on-7 is going to make it competitive because teams want to win. They want to compete, maybe even potentially land an offer from Florida, like all those types of things. So I do think that it's at least more interesting to me to see some of these things happen. I think the benefits, like I said, of high school coaches being there, but I'm really interested to see if we start to shift from the underclassmen heavy type focus of a Friday Night Lights to maybe some of these guys to be seniors becoming a focus there. So that sort of remained to see for me. But again, official visitors visits still going on for a lot of these guys. I don't know how possible that'll be at this point, at least.
Yeah, I guess I should have been a little more clear. And that when I talk about talent, I do think that it's the 2026 class that this has to be a focus, maybe even some 2027 guys. You can't be one of those coaching staffs that gives up on evaluating early, no matter how hot your seat is for the upcoming season, because Florida fans certainly don't need to be reminded what happens when you're not ahead of the game when it comes to recruiting. So I think it's encouraging to see that, one, this coaching staff is being a little bit, wise to pivot from just the typical format for Friday Night Lights, knowing that it's lost its luster. I mean, you and I were both out there, what feels like 5 years ago, when Justin Fields, Jamar Chase, Jerry Jeudy, all were on one field. Yeah, all on one field together competing. That's not going to happen anymore. As sad as that is, the game has just changed a little bit. You're not going to have those guys taking 1v1 reps under the lights on Friday anymore. I would love for it to happen. It just doesn't seem like it's going to be something that's as common in the NIL transfer portal era. So, especially with this recruiting calendar that you mentioned.
And even huddle now, guys are like, why would I come camp? Just watch my tape. Camping isn't really what it was, X amount of years ago, where guys, really wanted to come and wow a staff and just compete. Like it's why would I do that? You can watch my film. Like there's all these clips on here. So.
Yeah, it's kind of sad to me in a way, but I do get it. I understand. I hate to mention the whole risk of injury factor. If you're someone who already has those 4 or 5 stars, minimize your risk. In my mind, you're already negotiating behind the scenes to land at a program for who's going to be able to give you the best opportunity. Let me put it that way. So I totally understand it. Unless you're a really ultra competitive guy, it's not something for you right now at Friday Night Lights. So good to see the focus on 2026 guys who maybe haven't earned that respect on the recruiting trail. And, you mentioned Will Griffin going to be on campus as well. That's certainly going to help Florida get a sense of some of those guys that could be the next ones up, because they're going to need to certainly, I think, if this coaching staff is here next year in Gainesville, signing a top class in 2026 is going to be an absolute priority for this team. Just knowing that, you can't be satisfied with whatever you do here. You have to find a way to continue to get over the hump and solidify this rebuild that's been ongoing. So I know we threw a lot of info out at you. I really appreciate Blake Alderman joining the podcast and talking all things Florida recruiting, transfer portal, recapping this whole month. We're going to let him get out of here because I'm sure that he just, tired from talking so much, has a lot to go on. A lot of respect for all the work that you've done for the past month. Hopefully you get a chance to breathe after this Friday Night Lights and take some time before the barbecue. We'll obviously be back with another episode before Florida has their cookout event. And soon we'll be turning our focus to season mode. We'll bring a little bit of an SEC Media Days preview to you. Jacob Runder is out in Omaha right now covering the Florida baseball team as we're recording this Tuesday morning. They take on Kentucky tonight in the losers bracket to see if Florida can keep their season alive after the Gators got a 5-4 win over NC State yesterday. So a lot of coverage over at Swamp247, running some previews of the upcoming season as well. And like we mentioned, a ton of recruiting content. If you want to find out more, it's a perfect time to become a VIP subscriber over at Swamp247. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 podcast. For Graham Hall and Blake Alderman, we'll see you next time.